So this is one that I actually found on Reddit, but I found super interesting and one that I wanted to chat to you about. So basically, the post said, Mr. Bennet is a bad husband and father. And oh my gosh, this took me on a bit of a, you know, rabbit hole of this like whole subreddit on people just like not liking Mr. Bennet and thinking that he's, you know, really problematic as a father and as a husband and everything. And I was like, wow, like I feel like this is worth chatting about because I have always really liked Mr. Bennet. I do recognize that he isn't the best of fathers to the younger girls, but I don't think it's necessarily intentional. I think it's actually just a personality thing, but I'd love to chat about it. You know, what's your thoughts on this, that Mr. Bennet is this like bad husband and father?
Yeah, this is so interesting. I'm feeling kind of contemplative about it because, yeah, I've always loved his character. He has such a funny wit. His reactions to Mrs. Bennet are hysterical. Like, I think he provides a lot of comic relief in the novel, and his special connection with Lizzie is so endearing. And so I've always really liked him too, and kind of pitied him in a way because it's clear he's not happy in his marriage. But when you read that, Mr. Bennet is a bad husband and father, I think that's fair. I think it's a fair comment. I think, you know, he married Mrs. Bennet when she was really beautiful and young and everything, and obviously doesn't really respect her as a person. And of course, she's very annoying, but it's like he becomes disillusioned by her and then just uses her. It just makes her look ridiculous all the time and winds her up. So I think if he were a good husband, he'd be more reassuring of her and calm her anxieties. So yeah, as a husband, and he's not responsible financially. He retreats to his library. Mrs. Bennet, part of the reason she feels so frantic is Mr. Bennet isn't taking a lot of initiative and action to do things for his family. I don't know. What do you think about that?
That is true. I kind of get the sense that he's kind of like drowning in all of the issues, and as a result, is just like retreating into the world that he enjoys, just like reading in his library, being on his own, and just maybe burying his head in the sand a little bit, just about like everything else that's going on, which must be pretty overwhelming. I mean, he's the head of the household, and his household is made up of, you know, like all women. It's just like, it's just loads of women, which obviously in this day and age is just like not in this day and age, in that day and age, is not very practical, because basically at least one of his daughters needs to marry well to secure the others. And he's got a lot of daughters to marry off, and also the estate's going to be entailed away to his to the cousin, Mr. Collins, who it's said that him and Mr. Bennet and his brother didn't have a great relationship or something, and so, you know, that's probably, he's not too happy that the estate's been entailed away to that side of the family and things. So yeah, I can kind of see him burying his head in the sand a little bit, but yeah, you're right. I mean, he isn't a great husband to Mrs. Bennet. But then show me an example in Jane Austen's work where they have a pretty, you know, nerved and crazed wife and a husband that's really sympathetic and supportive. I mean, it makes me think of like the Palmers. Like Mr. Palmer is like over Mrs. Palmer. He's just like, nah, I'm not dealing with this. And even like the Allens, like if you think about Mr. and Mrs. Allen, when they take Catherine to Bath, like Mrs. Allen's like fretting about like, we don't know anybody, what we're gonna do, this is all very awkward, Mr. Allen. And he's just like, he's gone, he's just like, I'm out of here. Think about the Musgroves. Mary is like crazy and like super anxious and nervous all the time, and Charles is, you know, living in his own world, you know, going on about random stuff. So show me an example of the, you know, this perfect sympathetic husband to the you know, nervous wife.
All right, no, I can't think of one.
Just like, where is this husband? You know, I just think maybe that was just like a common theme in Austen's work, that she kind of shows that dynamic, that it's kind of like the wife that's a little bit crazy and maybe a little bit more like socially obsessed than the husband who likes to retreat and it just hasn't got the time to deal with the craziness. But that's not to say that it's good and right. I think he sees a lot of his wife and the 3 younger daughters, and so that's why I think he kind of cuts them off. But also I was thinking about this earlier, and Jane and Elizabeth are like unproblematic children. Do you know what I mean? They're like self-sufficient. They do their own stuff. Jane pretty much is the mediator in the house. Like, she keeps everything calm. So what does he need to do for them? Nothing. He even says, you know, wherever you and Jane go, you will be respected and people will, you know, want to associate with you. Your 3 younger sisters, that's a different story. But, you know, he knows that he doesn't need to do any work for them the way that he sees it. He goes and calls on Mr. Bingley. I know he teases Mrs. Bennet about that he doesn't, but he does go and do that. So he does set it up that Elizabeth and Jane could potentially have a good match. But I don't know what else he necessarily needs to do for them. They're pretty sorted, apart from the fact that he could have handled his finances a bit better.
That is such a good point. And so, yeah, I think it's good that we give him credit that even though he was winding Mrs. Bennet up, he did go visit Mr. Bingley. So he did do the thing he needed to do to establish the connection. But apart from that, just like you said, I see this person's argument that he's not a good husband and father because of his apathy. Maybe he himself is nervous about the financial situation, but however he handled it, he kind of went into denial and didn't take care of things actively, and then kind of makes fun of his wife for fretting about it. You know, like, he's the one who, he's not in control of the entail, but he's the one who put them in this more dire financial situation. And like you said, Jane and Lizzie are really self-sufficient and well-rounded, and he really could have used his influence in a positive way because he is a smart, measured man. And instead of guiding Mary, Kitty, and Lydia, he retreats and he makes fun of them to their faces, and he says that they're 3 of the silliest girls in England. And even though Lydia laughs it off and none of them really react to it, when you're a girl in your teens, you care so much about your parents' opinions, and there's no way you don't internalize part of that. Yeah, so I think that was really wrong.
That is true. And I actually feel the worst for Mary, because I feel like Mary isn't, you know, being daft and embarrassing herself in society. I think she maybe accidentally does, like sometimes when she's like overexcited about playing the piano and things in public. And isn't that great? But well, isn't that great at singing? But I think in terms of like her interests, they aren't too far removed from what Mr. Bennet's interest is. She really likes reading. She really likes to have like philosophical, insightful conversations. Yes, they are heavy on like the religious side, which I think you kind of get the sense from Mr. Bennet that he isn't massively religious, in the sense that he kind of finds Mr. Collins and Mary kind of annoying, and we don't hear him say anything that sounds particularly like religious or faith driven. So, but I don't understand his kind of like why he pins Mary with Lydia and Kitty, because I don't see the similarities between them personally. I don't see Mary as silly and daft like Kitty and Lydia are.
She's not like vacuous, and she's not superficial. Like, I think Lydia and Kitty are very into materialism, superficial things, boy crazy. She's not in that category. I think she's in a different category, but I think the reason Mr. Bennet doesn't have patience for her either is Mary's really pedantic, and she puts on airs like she's so knowledgeable, but she actually doesn't know the right thing to say. Like that line, Mary wished to say something sensible but knew not how. Like the fact, I think, like Mr. Bennet and Lizzie are both so socially savvy that when Mr. Collins is sitting there at the dinner table, Mary's looking at him like, oh wow, you're so smart, and Mr. Bennet and Lizzie are both like, oh my gosh, what an idiot. So I think it's more, he thinks Mary's ridiculous because she's trying to be this great intellectual, but she's not actually very savvy. But I agree, she's in a different category than Kitty and Lydia.
But I do think that Elizabeth and Mr. Bennet are quite harsh to people sometimes. Like, I think there's a reason that Jane Austen really likes Elizabeth, and I think it's because she had a similar way of judging people. Like there's so much evidence in her letters that she wasn't the most sympathetic of people. Like, she would say some pretty harsh things at times, and she didn't mind like poking fun at people, even if it came across kind of mean at times. And I feel like Elizabeth and Mr. Bennet share that they're able to kind of, in their inside jokes, they do humiliate people. Like, even if it's just between the two of them, they really do that. And I feel like they have this sense that they are kind of superior, even if it's not I feel like it's like an intellectual superiority, that they think they're like above everybody else, and they can have these private jokes and conversations that nobody else gets and knows about. And if you don't, then everyone else is daft in comparison.
I think that's especially fair for Mr. Bennet. I can't tell I think it's more even a social intelligence. He and Lizzie are socially intelligent, and Jane is to I think a little lesser degree, or maybe the same, but isn't gonna make fun of people because
doesn't want to make sport of her neighbors like they do.
Right. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Oh my gosh. But I agree. I think the mean-spirited, it's more he's probably trying to just entertain himself, but he does belittle people in his family. He'll make fun of them, and it's not nice, whatever the intention is.
In defense of him in terms of the financial situation, though, obviously they needed a son and they wanted a son. The fact that a son never came, can we blame him for that? Like, that's not his fault that there was never an heir to the fortune, because having a son isn't just that the property gets obviously gets passed down to the son. The son has the ability to go out and make more money. And so the fact that Mr. Bennet is getting older, he's got this one estate, and he's got no one else to financially contribute to their family pot, I think is a massive burden. Supporting 5 daughters is a lot. Like, that is a lot of people to support, and your wife. That's a lot. And he makes the point of saying, like, even with Lydia getting married off to Wickham, like, he's saving because he was like spending so much money on her pocket money because she like spends like her money all the time. And so, yeah, I think in terms of financially, I think you have to consider that is that he is the sole breadwinner, because that's how it was back then. Like, the women couldn't go and get a job. And so it all falls on his shoulders. And I think that is a heavy burden to bear. And I don't think we can criticize him because he wasn't able to heir a son.
Yeah, I think that's so fair. I think the entailment system was so unfair, obviously. And it's not his fault that he couldn't heir a son. I think it's more, especially once he had a few daughters in a row. I remember there's this part where he basically says, oh, I didn't start saving up at the beginning because I banked on the fact I was going to have a son. And then when I realized, that might not happen, it seemed a little bit too late to start saving. So I just think he could have had a little bit more foresight and taken more initiative earlier to make sure that his daughters were, financially okay. And I agree with you that it was a huge burden. It was a huge burden on him, and everyone makes mistakes, and he clearly does have regrets about it.
Yeah, I can imagine so. Yeah, I think it's such a tough one. Like, I don't know. Like, I do see why he's a bad father, and I think there's worse though. I think there's a lot like this, worse parents or worse parent-child dynamics that out there for sure. But I do think for the younger sisters it is pretty terrible. And gosh, I mean, thank God that Mr. Darcy steps up, because I cannot see Mr. Bennet being able to sort the situation with Lydia out successfully. I think that would have been it. Like you said, I don't think he has enough foresight to be able to deal with problems like that. I think he is someone that just retreats into his head, and if something becomes an external problem that he's got to sort, I think he has no skills whatsoever in. I don't know what he would have done. And obviously in the 2005 adaptation, they have the Gardiners with no children. But in the book, the Gardiners have like tons of their own kids anyway. So even though the thought is that the Gardiners pay for Lydia and for Wickham's commission and for Lydia and Wickham to get married, I don't see how they could have, for what Wickham wanted money-wise. I don't see how they could have done that, support their own children. For me, I'm just like, thank God that Darcy had such strong feelings for Elizabeth, because it would have been a mess otherwise.
Yeah, that's interesting. I had mixed feelings when you said that, because I agree that Mr. Bennet wouldn't have been able to resolve the situation. And I can't remember exactly what the quotation is, but when he thinks that Mr. Gardiner has been the one to save the situation, he's like, don't worry, Lizzie, I should feel badly about all of this, but I'll forgive myself sooner than I probably should. Like, he acknowledges his apathy a little bit and his the fact that he doesn't take responsibility a whole ton. Like, he acknowledges his character flaws, and at the same time, he did step up and he did go to London and he did try to look for her. So, yeah, I think in this situation, I would think it's too exaggerated to call him a villain. I don't think he's a villain. I think he's a character that's in the middle. I think he's not the best husband and father in certain ways. I think he has a very tender relationship with Lizzie, where he's a great father at the end when he says, I couldn't have parted with you for someone less worthy. Like, even though Mr. Darcy has a lot of money, like, he wanted to make sure that Lizzie loved him. That was him stepping up. And then I think he's an endearing, funny character. So he's just someone who's in the middle. He's a human. He has flaws, but also I still like him as a character and I see his good qualities.
Yeah, I mean, he's like an incredible father to Elizabeth, I would say, because he doesn't make her marry Mr. Collins, which Mrs. Bennet would have been right on that. Like, she even tries to.
Yeah, good.
Like, he's like, you don't have to do that because I'm not losing my like favorite child and putting her in a situation where she's going to be unhappy in a marriage. And I actually don't think he would have forced any of his daughters into a marriage they'd be unhappy with, because he knows what that's like. So even the daughters that he thinks are silly, like, I think the only reason, obviously, that Lydia and Wickham get married is because there is no choice in that situation. It would ruin the entire family if they don't get married. And Lydia, for all intents and purposes, is happy to marry Wickham. But I don't think he would have forced any of his daughters to marry out of love if they wanted to marry for love. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought up that point, and I realized, oh my gosh, I was not giving him enough credit. I think that's a hugely impressive moment on his part as a father, that he said you'll be at a loss to one of your parents, and he stood up and said, I don't want you to marry Mr. Collins, because for him, that would have taken all the pressure off of his situation. If Lizzie had married Mr. Collins, the financial, all the entailment stuff would have been taken care of. That would have logistically been night and day easier and less stressful for Mr. Bennet. But he loved his daughter. He didn't want his daughter to be with someone who was lesser than her and an idiot. And that was a big moment where he stepped up as a father. So yes, I totally agree. He was a good father to Elizabeth.
I guess devil's advocate could be that he just didn't want Mr. Collins like more in his life than he already was.
Fair.
So I guess he could have like maybe said to like Mary, because we all kind of ship the whole marrying Mr. Collins thing. You could have been like, Mary, do you want to marry Mr. Collins? But yeah, I think that's like a massive thing that he doesn't do that. And I also think after the Lydia situation, he stepped up more for Kitty and Mary. He's like, you are no way are you going away with any officers. I don't even want officers in my house. Like, it's just not happening, because I have learned from this terrible mistake that I'm not, I can't go like put anyone through this again. So he really puts his foot down at that point. And I think that like when there's kind of the descriptions at the end of the books about like Kitty and Mary after, I think that changes their directory entirely. You know what I mean? They go on a different path. Once Lydia's out of the picture, I can imagine that things are a lot better. And obviously the financial burden's taken away because Lizzie and Jane both marry really well. But yeah, I think he probably does step up a bit more after he realizes, it could have been crisis points.
Yeah, I agree with that. I hope he doesn't overcorrect, and I hope Kitty was able to at least like maybe go out in society sometimes. But yeah, I agree with what you're saying. I don't think he would want his daughters to marry anyone they didn't love. I think he steps up as a father after the mistake he's made with being too apathetic surrounding Lydia. I also think one of his really good qualities is he's a good judge of character. Like, remember, he laughs about Wickham being kind of a little bit sleazy. Like, he reads Wickham really well kind of before anyone else, and he'll make little comments here and there. And I think that those comments can have an impact too.
Yeah, I think that would sway Lizzie, because Lizzie's so proud about like her level of sense and judgment of people. And I think like his comments where he's like, maybe it's your time to be crossed in love, and like he like says to Wickham, like, let Wickham be the man. Let Wickham be the man to break your heart. And I think those things would stick with someone like Elizabeth, because she'd be like, look, my dad obviously thinks that Wickham's not ideal, and I, as a result, also think Wickham's not ideal. I just think that's the kind of relationship that they have. Like, he has that kind of influence over it. It's not harsh and direct, but it's just like these subtle comments that will make a difference. I personally believe.
I think so too. And I think he can diffuse things sometimes. He either can inflame or diffuse things with humor, and his sense of humor just, I think, brings so much joy to the novel, I think.
Yeah, I do. I've always been a big fan of him, but I do find this like subreddit of Reddit really interesting. Like, yeah, I know people are really opinionated on this stance, and I don't see that on a lot of other platforms. So I think it is really interesting to see it from this stance, and to really consider, you know, the ways that he does fall short for some of the other daughters. But in terms of a husband as well, I actually think the dynamic that he has with Mrs. Bennet is right, because what use would it be if he was freaking out as well? I think she'd die. I genuinely think she'd have a heart attack. If he was freaking out about everything and she was freaking out about everything, I actually think the fact that he seems so distant from the problems is probably helpful for her. Like, I know that she's freaking out, but I genuinely think the fact that he stays so, like, calm, even if he's not, I think probably makes a massive difference. And also just tries to make it humorous. Like, don't take it so seriously. Like, I'm just joking. I have seen Mr. Bingley. Just playing with you. Like, I feel like sometimes turning your anxieties into something that is humorous is sometimes better than encouraging someone else to panic with you.
I think that's right. I think it is adaptive, right? Because I think it's good that he stays calm, and I think he would be a lot more annoyed or angry with her if he took everything she said seriously. So I think instead of getting annoyed, if he can turn it into humor, that keeps him calm. And so sometimes I think that's good. Sometimes I think it diffuses it. It reminds Mrs. Bennet not to take everything so seriously. And sometimes it makes her, like, when he winds her up, sometimes it inflames it a little bit too. But usually at the end, he can calm her down.
Yeah, but when she knows he's done the right thing, she's like, ha ha ha, isn't your father such a funny guy? Like,
that's true.
Yeah, you know, it just lightens the mood a little bit, because otherwise she's just so intense. I mean, she's absolutely hilarious, but yeah, I do like that element. And I love in the 1995 one, the last comment that they make when he puts his arm around Mrs. Bennet, and she's like, Mr. Bennet, God's been so kind to us, and like he's like, yes, he has, and then like you see Darcy and Elizabeth kiss. I just think that's like such a lovely scene, like just to show that obviously I don't really think it's a toxic relationship necessarily. I think personality-wise, they don't click, but I do think there is mutual affection there for the sense that they're going through life together. Does that make sense?
Yes. I think toxic is too strong of a word. I think they realize pretty early in their marriage that they're not the most compatible in some ways, but they make it work, and they get to a balance. They always come back to a balance, and so you could argue like it's functional.